It is 12:02. I'm Ted Barbieri. I'm on the faculty here at Albany Law School, and I'm going to turn things over to Professor Pat Reyhan.
Hi, as many of you know, I'm Pat Reyhan. I only just yesterday learned that I don't have to have a mask on when I teach you. So all this time I've had the mask on. I didn't have to, and I'm just enjoying that freedom. And then I'll move to the other side of the podium and have to put it back on. Thank you for coming to First Mondays. First Mondays, Professor Barbieri and I believe are an important part of your legal education. It's part of the reason that we love to do it. To get a chance to stand back and to look at issues that aren't necessarily flagged as legal issues, but have a lot of impact on law, have a lot of impact on civics, have a lot of impact on society. And sometimes, as last week, we deal with an absolute crisis that pops up in the world. And sometimes we deal with issues that aren't so much a part of our daily life about which we're aware, but yet are very important parts of our daily life. And the subject that Christopher is going to talk about today is one of those. Every American citizen, and certainly every American lawyer, should know about the Federal Reserve, should know its impact on our daily lives. The Federal Reserve impacts your lives in ways many people more famous do not. So it's a perfect topic. As always with First Mondays, we like to bring more light than heat to a topic in a respectful discussion after Christopher's remarks. And I'll turn it to Ted and put my mask back.
Excellent. One other logistical item is we want to welcome, we want to say Happy Stoneman Day. It's Kate Stoneman Day here on campus. Kate Stoneman was the first woman to graduate from Albany Law School and the first woman to graduate from any law school in our state and to be admitted to practice in New York State. So we welcome everyone to the DAMC upstairs at 5 o'clock for that award ceremony. It's fitting to have this conversation with our guest, Christopher Leonard, to talk about his book, The Lords of Easy Money. Now, I think with the war in Ukraine, spiking consumer prices, not just because of the COVID-19 pandemic, but for other reasons too, gasoline has increased in price nationally around 20%. And he talks a lot in the book about one of the Fed Board of Governors, I believe it's Honig, am I saying his last name right? Who sort of provides an entree into the workings of the Federal Reserve and the Fed Board of Governors and the Fed Open Market Committee, specifically around not just consumer prices, but also things like asset prices, not just home values, but also the price of company equity, stocks, bonds, and that notion of the difference between inflation and consumer prices, things like gasoline, and inflation in asset prices resonate throughout the book. So, Christopher, we're really excited to have you here today to present on this work, which I really enjoyed reading. I think it's such, and I imagine in talking to audiences across the country about the book, I'm sure you've had to deal with this question of complexity of the topic, and just sort of breaking down. I think that the book does a very good job of explaining the complexities in monetary policy at the Fed versus fiscal policy in Congress and in the White House. So if you would, sort of take us through what went into, sort of the arguments that you advance in the book, and sort of, maybe break down what, why you think, what compelled you to take on this subject at book length at this point.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. And thank you for having me. I appreciate it. For what it's worth as background, my dad was an attorney and he was a litigator and gave me a really deep love and respect for the law. And like I say, the rebellious children of attorneys tend to become journalists. So that's sort of what I ended up doing. And it's great to be here. So please, and I really appreciate the idea that the discussion should bring more light than heat. I'm a big proponent of that point of view. Although I will own that I'm pretty critical of what the Federal Reserve has done over the last decade. The subtitle of the book is How the Fed Broke the American Economy. So I won't shy away from those critiques, but I will also say a big point and goal of the book is to help people understand why the Federal Reserve is so important, how it affects our lives, and how it has really had a huge effect on our economy over the last decade. So with that in mind, what drew me to this, and your question as to why I'm even in this space, is that I'm a business reporter, I'm a journalist, and I see my job as explaining and describing the most important financial institutions in our country and how they affect our political system and our economic system. My first book was about the monopolies in our meat industry. The second book was about a very large private corporation and corporate power in America. And I came to the central bank, the Federal Reserve, first of all, because one of my primary preoccupations as a reporter is to try to understand income inequality. I feel like income inequality is one of the most important issues in America today. It is important to understanding what's going on in our society, to understand why, you can have a decade of economic growth, but the gains are captured by a very small group of people. That leads to so much of what we see in our society today, and I would argue so much of our social instability. And in 2016, I came to see how the Federal Reserve played such an important role in this. So I will walk through what the Fed is and what it does, but first let me start with the headline. Over the last decade, the Fed has really been engaged in radical policies. It's been engaged in unprecedented experiments, and it has enlarged its intervention in our economy to a degree we've never seen. The headline number that I use all the time is the following. Okay, the Federal Reserve has one superpower. It's the only institution in the world that can create new dollars out of thin air. That's why we created the Fed. The central bank was built to not just create our currency, but to manage our currency. That thing we call a dollar is actually a Federal Reserve note, okay? It's what originates and creates our currency. And the Fed, over the first century of its existence, the Fed steadily and slowly increased the amount of new dollars in circulation. And economists call this sort of pool of original dollars, they call it the monetary base, okay? So the Fed slowly and steadily increased the number of new dollars over about 100 years until there were $900 billion as the sort of foundation of base money in the United States. So picture a graph that goes from 0 to 900 billion over 100 years. And then between 2008 and 2014, the Fed prints $3.5 trillion. So that's 350 years of money creation concentrated in about 4.5 years. That's a step change. That's a departure from historic norms. And it's just the beginning of a decade of experimental money creation, I think is the best way to put it. This is a decade of what we call easy money policies. The Fed, gosh, between 2008 and 2020, the Fed creates $7 trillion, okay? That's 700 years of money creation in a little over a decade. And it's printing all this money at the same time that the Fed is keeping interest rates pegged near zero. Okay, so I can walk through the effects of this, but let's just, for the purposes of this discussion, we have a decade in which the Fed reduces what you can earn by saving money by keeping that interest rate pegged at zero. Incidentally, rates had hit zero a few times in the past, but the Fed kept them pinned at zero for a decade. And at the same time, the Fed is printing all this new money, as I described. So what I try to walk through in my book is the decision-making behind these policies, why the Fed did what it did, and what the impacts have been out here, frankly, in the real world and real economy.
Right. So tremendous amount of power in one location. and a specific period of, as you say, printing, but adding 100 years worth of, or more than 100 years worth of money at one time. So what, to talk a little bit about, if you wouldn't mind, talk a little about what you see as the consequence of that action, and specifically the character that you feature in the book, his sort of contrarian perspective and why that's so important.
Yeah, that's great. Okay, that's a great place to start.
Yeah.
First of all, it's a little bit of background. The Federal Reserve, the central bank, was created in 1913, and it was created in a way to insulate the Fed from voters. The Fed is undemocratic in the way an independent agency like the Environmental Protection Agency or the Security and Exchange Commission is independent. So the Fed is run by a board of governors and regional bank presidents who are not elected by the public. And the idea there is that the Fed's leadership committee can think with a long-term view and also do things that are unpopular, because to manage the money supply, sometimes you need to raise interest rates, which can cause a recession. So the Fed was given independence so it could think long-term and do unpopular things. Well, the book opens in 2010 when the top policy committee inside the Federal Reserve, it's called the Federal Open Markets Committee, or the FOMC. This committee, when you hear about the Fed deciding to raise interest rates or cut interest rates, it's a decision made by this committee. So in 2010, this committee is meeting to make a really consequential decision to unleash this new experiment called quantitative easing, which is basically just the rapid and massive creation of new money that's injected into the banking system. When I talk about the Fed printing money, that's sort of colloquial shorthand for injecting newly created cash reserves into the banking system. The main character you talked about is this guy named Thomas Honig, who sat on this committee at the Fed, and who, not coincidentally, was the longest serving member sitting on this committee. Honig had been on the committee since 1991. He'd been at the Fed since 1972. And he had seen over the decades the sort of third order consequences of what happens when the Federal Reserve does things too quickly or too dramatically. I'd say that this guy, Tom Honig, if he had a certain theory of how to govern the Fed, it was to use restraint and to move slowly, because as he describes it, the Fed policy has long and variable lags, meaning this committee will make a decision, but then the impact of that decision might not be felt for months or years out. And he was very concerned about what the Fed wanted to do in 2010, which was to pump this money into the banking system and pin interest rates at zero. And this guy, Tom Honig, voted no at this policy committee. He voted no at every single meeting during 2010, which frankly, we can walk through this, but it kind of ruined his reputation. It kind of wrecked his career at the Fed. This guy, Tom Honig, got remembered as being a sort of cranky dissenter, a reflexive no voter. And his views were characterized as being a hyperinflation hawk, or in other words, people said he voted no because he's worried we would see inflation if the Fed printed all this money or kept interest rates at zero, and that he was wrong about that. We never saw significant price inflation. But I found, when I went back and looked at the historical record, Tom Honig was making a very different argument about what could go wrong if the Fed did this. And I sincerely believe he's actually been proven correct by the ensuing decade. In other words, he levied a warning that turned out to be quite accurate. And Honig warned that if the Fed pursued this path, it was going to do three things, okay? It would have three negative consequences. The first is that the Fed would dramatically widen the gap between the rich and everybody else. And the reason for that is simple. These policies, these easy money policies, stoke asset prices, okay? Professor, you mentioned that at the opening, that we think about inflation all the time as being the inflation of consumer prices, like the price of food and energy and cars. That's the inflation that's rising really high right now. But there's another kind of inflation, which is the inflation of asset prices. That's the price of the stocks, bonds, real estate. Asset prices can also inflate and be driven up by Federal Reserve actions. And in fact, the Fed knew that if it pursued these policies of low interest rates and printing money, it was going to stoke asset prices. In fact, that was really the goal of these policies, because the Fed wanted the stock market to rise. It wanted bond prices to rise, because that would create the so-called wealth effect, okay? The Fed was trying to drive economic growth, but it could really only do that by driving up stock prices and bond prices. So what Honig was saying was that this is really going to only benefit the rich. The wealthiest 1% of Americans own roughly 40% of all the assets in the country. The top 10% of Americans own 65% of all the assets, whereas the bottom wealth half of Americans, in other words, half of Americans who earn their living through a paycheck, they only own about 5% of the assets in the country. So a policy that drives up asset prices is necessarily going to widen the gap between rich and poor. Honig secondly warned that this policy was going to just massively increase risk in our financial system, because it was going to drive up stock prices to a level where they could crash. It was going to encourage banks to make risky loans. It was going to reduce the incentive to save money, and it was going to create another bubble, in short. And then the third warning he gave was that once the Fed started doing this, once it started printing money and cutting rates, it was going to find it almost impossible to stop. It was going to enter a monetary policy quagmire that it would be very difficult to withdraw from. And it would be trapped in a cycle of having to print ever more money to keep markets afloat. And in my view, based on the evidence, all three of these warnings turned out to be true. And we're living with the consequences of all three of these things now.
Yeah, thanks so much for walking us through those points. So just want to make sure that the students in the room and folks participating online have a clear understanding about what the Fed is, what it does, and how it's governed, and just make sure that we understand that, as we understand the implications. So you talked about, we don't carry dollars in our wallet, we carry Federal Reserve notes. Fed the FOMC, the Fed Open Market Committee, sets interest rates. There's significant involvement of private enterprise too, and private banks, right? This surprised me, and something I didn't know from that you covered very early on in the book. There's just the Fed is owned by private banks, right?
Yes. Yes.
So just like I think there's significant democracy implications too. But so if I understand it right, so private banks own stock in the Fed.
That's exactly right. So I'll walk through the history if that's helpful.
Great.
Okay. The way I put it is that if America could exist without a central bank, we would have done it. We've chartered a national bank twice in America and then revoked the charter back in the early centuries of the country before we finally kind of relented and formed the Federal Reserve in 1913. And the reasons why we did it is that you really can't have a modern functioning industrial capitalist society without a central bank. I think that's pretty clear. So before we had the Federal Reserve, there was not a national recognized currency. In fact, there were actually, believe it or not, there were thousands of currencies in the United States in the late 1800s, early 1900s. And it created a very chaotic, unpredictable, and unstable financial system. It was a financial system characterized by periodic bank panics and wildly volatile currency valuations. it was just a mess in shorthand. And there was actually this sort of broad public movement to create a national central bank, to create a national currency that could be controlled by a committee instead of being controlled by wild, volatile market prices, which is all really pretty interesting. So the Fed is formed in 1913, and it has two key goals. The first is to create and manage a national currency. And so that's what the Fed does. And then the second job the Fed has is to be the so-called lender of last resort to other banks when there's a panic. The Fed, in the case of a panic, was built to print new money to loan to otherwise healthy banks to stop bank panics. Now, there's a one critical point here that you've kind of brought up, which is how the Fed interacts with the private banking system. So back in the early 1900s, there was a push to create a central bank, and the push was in large part driven by these populist political movements, like the populist movement in rural America. Actually, here in Kansas, where I'm based, there were these movements to create a central bank. And there's a great history of this called Secrets of the Temple by Richard Greeder, in which he lays out how the East Coast banking establishment realized that they either basically needed to control this train or they were going to be run over by it. So it sounds conspiratorial, but the literal real history is that a group of bankers met on a resort off the coast of Georgia called Jekyll Island, and they fashioned a sort of a compact or a structure of the central bank that would make sure the central bank didn't displace Wall Street. So what they did is they chartered the central bank to basically exist sort of nested within the Wall Street banking system or behind it. So when we talk about the Fed, for example, creating new dollars, it doesn't just create those new dollars in any way. It doesn't create those new dollars, for example, inside the checking account of working people or inside a decentralized system. The Fed can only create new dollars inside the bank accounts of 24 designated institutions on Wall Street that are called primary dealers. And these are the folks you would probably assume. They're JP Morgan, Goldman Sachs, Wells Fargo. The primary dealers on Wall Street are the one reservoir where the Fed can create new money. So the Fed, as you pointed out, it's also owned by the member banks in a way that's complicated. For example, member banks will own the Fed, but they're not allowed to sell the stock that they have in the Fed. So it's sort of a binded like ownership structure. But suffice it to say, the Fed was built so that it would not displace the Wall Street system. And, you know, if you fast forward to 2020, you can see that the Fed is deeply, deeply integrated with the Wall Street system. For example, you know, when the Fed goes out and, quote, buys new assets, as it did during the COVID crash, it buys it through these private sector hedge funds like BlackRock. And, you know, the CEO of BlackRock, Larry Fink, was on the phone with the Federal Reserve Chairman, Jerome Powell, several times a day. And there's very tight integration between the Wall Street banking system and the Federal Reserve.
I think that history is very useful to know, right? So this is not just technocrats. This is the integration of technocrats and captains of industry in a lot of ways. We do have a question in chat related to the 2007, 2008 housing market crash from Stephanie Oyola Reynoso. So Stephanie asked, during the market crash in 2007 that led to a massive short for some to grow their assets, was the Fed's policy a result of that, or is that a gap from what was learned previously, or sort of what's the connection there? And just as I was reading the question, the one thing made me one thing I was recalled from the book was the Fed sort of shifting the inflation in the stock market, or sort of shifting from a stock market bubble in the early 2000s to a housing bubble in 2008. That was something that you covered sort of earlier on. So yeah, I don't know, how did the housing bubble fit into the Fed policy?
This is a great question. Thank you. So they're very tightly connected. This is actually a core and key part of what happened. So to back up a little bit, the Federal Reserve, what it's trying to do is manage the economy. And I describe it as like the committee that runs the Fed is like a group of engineers inside the control room of a nuclear reactor. They're trying to keep the reactor just hot enough to generate power, but if the reactor core gets too hot, they want to cool it down. And they want to cool it down by so-called tightening the money supply or raising interest rates so there's not as many dollars floating around out there, which cools economic activity. But then if they see the economy is too slow or too cold, they want to heat it up again by making money flow more easily, or more easy money policies with lower interest rates. Okay, so that's kind of the general picture of what the FOMC is trying to do. But as you mentioned, something really interesting starts to happen in the 90s and the 2000s, which is that the Fed decides, okay, when we're looking at the control panel in this nuclear reactor, we're only going to care about price inflation. Okay, if we see the prices start to rise really fast, we're going to slow down. We're going to tighten the money supply. We're going to cool the reactor. But as long as we don't see that price inflation, we're going to keep stoking the machine. We're going to keep interest rates low. We're going to keep money flowing. We're going to keep money easy. But what they're not thinking about in this, or rather what they are thinking about, but what they're not controlling, is that asset inflation that we've mentioned earlier. Okay, so what happens is the engineers at the Fed are keeping money easy. They're not seeing price inflation, which is this whole thing we could talk about, but asset prices are rising. Okay, and in the late 1990s, you see this huge asset bubble in the stock market form and then explode. It's what we call the dot-com crash. It was really awful. And there's this crash, and then after that, the Fed responds by lowering interest rates even further and making money even cheaper. So then during the 2000s, we see another asset bubble rise, and this one is in the housing market. It's in real estate prices, and we have this whole crazy era of the mid 2000s to the late 2000s when the housing market is just insane. Let's put it that way. Housing prices are rising across the board. Lots of stupid loans are getting made. The Fed's policies would just, without question, they fed into that frenzy and that asset bubble. And then boom, that bubble crashes in 2008, which brings us to Stephanie's question. How does that tie in to what we see? Here's how it ties in. The financial crash of 2008 was a truly catastrophic event that almost plunged the world into a global depression. I mean, it was a nasty, nasty global financial panic. And the Fed responded with an unprecedented level of intervention. It printed $1 trillion over about a year, during the crash of 2008, 2009. And that's as much money as the Fed had created in its first century. Okay, so it was a huge intervention. But here's the very, very important and interesting hinge moment. It happens in 2010, which, as I mentioned earlier, that's when this book starts. So in 2009, 2010, economic growth in America was still really weak, and unemployment was still really high. And we still had a hangover from that housing market crash and the resulting financial market crash. And what's interesting to me is that, the economists and experts were fully aware that the few years that happened after the financial crisis were going to be economically bad and pitiful. Like after a financial crash, it's understood you're going to have years of weak growth because everyone's digging out from the debts they assumed during the run up to the bubble crash. But even though they knew that growth was going to be weak, the Federal Reserve, and in fact, like kind of our entire federal government, felt this need to respond to drive economic growth. And to me, one of the very interesting elements of what happened during that decade that I try to talk about in the book is that the democratic institutions in the United States, which are the so-called fiscal authorities, meaning the authorities that can like tax and spend and do big things, these authorities were paralyzed and dysfunctional. And I'm talking about the United States Congress, the White House, state legislatures. These democratic institutions were increasingly paralyzed and dysfunctional, really culminating, well, not even culminating, but exacerbated by the election of 2010, when the Tea Party movement sweeps into power in Congress and really just shuts down the federal Congress. With the democratic institutions kind of on the sidelines, the central banks decide that they are going to step in, that they are going to try to drive economic growth, even if they were not really originally chartered to do that. Remember, I mean, the Fed was created to manage the currency and be a lender of last resort. And in 2010, the Fed takes on this much more central role of being the kind of engine of economic growth and using its money printing powers as like a jobs program. That's what was driving these policies of 0% interest rates and quantitative easing. So the relationship is pretty tight, actually. It was that we had a pretty bruised and battered and hollowed out economy after the crash of 2008. Our democratic institutions were floundering, and so the central banks stepped in and tried to drive growth through these policies. And I would argue, as we look back, we can now say the Fed is not a great tool to rely on to drive economic growth.
I think that's a really interesting place to at least summarize that portion of what your contributions. I'm thinking a couple of things. What's next? You know, does the Fed need to continue to print money in order to ensure that, you know, the bottom doesn't fall out of the stock market, for instance, to ensure that, you know, we certainly know that elected officials in the Senate and in the House, but Senate especially, look at the stock market and prices as an indicator of at least one indicator of wealth in the country. I'm also thinking about student loan debt, which, you know, wasn't covered in the book, but, you know, many see student loan debt as the next bubble. What happened? You know, is there any connection there, at least with respect to rates? You know, certainly something that's on the minds of all of our students. So, you know, Christopher, I'm not sure if you have thoughts about that, but I also want to give an opportunity for people in the room to ask a question. You know, if there's something that, you know, as well as online, but, you know, certainly as I look out, if you have folks in the room, any questions that you want to jump in, just, you know, shoot a hand up or you know, reach for your microphone. But I don't know and my colleague has a question over here.
First, Chris, do you want to respond to the points Ted made, and then I can ask my question?
Yes, and I'll try to keep it succinct to make more room for questions. I feel like we're actually in a terribly fragile position because of what the Fed has done over the last decade. And toward the last third of the book, I talk about how the Fed has tried to pull back on the money spigots, okay? Just to put it kind of colloquially like that. The Fed has tried to, starting at around 2016, 2017, 2018, the Fed was trying to raise interest rates again and trying to pull back some of this cash that it had injected into the banking system. But every time the Fed tries to tighten, it creates this whiplash or backlash in the markets, and you start to see market prices fall. Because again, stock, bonds, commodity prices, they were all boosted or elevated by what the Fed was doing. So it only makes sense that when the Fed pulls back, these prices fall again. But the Fed wasn't able or willing to let these prices fall. So that's what I talk about when I say that the Fed was trapped. Every time it tried to raise rates or pull back the money, it had to reverse itself and keep pumping the money in to make sure there wasn't a market crash. And that leads us to where we are today in 2022, which is that, for the first time since the early 80s, we are finally seeing pretty stark price inflation. Now, that price inflation is rising really fast, which is forcing the Fed to raise rates or pull back the cash injections. And that's going to create massive volatility in the marketplace. So I would argue that where we are today is this very, very fragile position where the Fed has really lost its ability to fight inflation in a very fundamental and significant way. If the Fed does if the Fed uses its standard toolbox to fight inflation, meaning if the Fed hikes rates or reverses quantitative easing, it's going to create a market crash. And the Fed knows this. So it's got very limited capacity to handle the rising inflation, the economic volatility we're seeing because of the Ukraine invasion. So we're in a pretty tight spot, is how I'd put it.
That so much anticipates the question comment I was going to make, because I have not yet had a chance to read your book. I was going to borrow it from Ted, but I think what you'd like to hear is I'll go buy it as well.
Yeah, right.
But what I find fascinating about this is probably like the students in the room, I tend to think of inflation as price inflation and not asset inflation. And that has made me wondering, why isn't the Fed doing something as you see this price inflation? And now I know, because it's going to rattle asset inflation. And I just hadn't thought about that. So it seems to me to tie back to one of your earliest points, once again, it's the income gap problem, right? Because the price inflation is disproportionately hitting people at the lower ends of the income spectrum, who are also disproportionately not getting the benefit of preserving the asset, allowing asset inflation to take place. And it just, I guess I find that it's so interesting, but once again, rather depressing, if you will.
Yeah, I agree too. And that's one of the problems as an investigative reporter, I guess, today. Like, most of my books do not end on a happy note. And it is depressing. It's important from a public policy standpoint to kind of follow up on the points you made. That's one of the big things I'm trying to talk about, is that these policies created a decade of economic activity that really did leave the vast majority of wage earning Americans behind. Wage earning Americans got very, very little benefit from these policies, while asset owners really got, in many ways, more benefit than they knew what to do with. I mean, the people who are packaging and selling this debt on Wall Street, the hedge funds, the private equity firms, as you all know, they're seeing just record levels of profits and huge increases in income and wealth. So you've had a decade when people have missed out on a lot of those gains. And then that brings you to 2022, where you're exactly right. This inflation hits wage earners extremely hard because prices are rising faster than wages. We're seeing really encouraging wage growth in the past year or so, but it's been wiped out by rising prices. And the Fed is constrained and in many ways handicapped or unable to fight inflation because of these exact policies. And again, I can't overstate how dramatic the backlash can be in the markets. The Fed tried to normalize back in 2018, and there was a huge kind of scary downward adjustment in the markets. And so they're trapped. And I guess, you know, for the purposes of like a classroom, if I could make this point that I don't explicitly make in the book, but this is a hard thing to argue from a policymaking standpoint, but really this does trace back to 2010. If the central bank had shown more restraint and humility at that point, with the price tag for fighting inflation would be a fraction of what it is today. And that's, to me, something I really ponder a lot. There's sort of a similar analogy, for example, in military affairs, that if a very powerful military, for example, the United States and Afghanistan, had spent more time negotiating with a very contemptible enemy, or trying to form a peace deal with the Taliban, if you will, we could have avoided many, many years of very expensive conflict, for example. To me, the analogy with monetary supply is pretty parallel. If more restraint had been displayed in 2010 and more long-term thinking had been displayed in 2010, the price tag we're facing today wouldn't be as high.
As you were talking, just was having a look at the history of the Fed funds rate, which, like as you talk about in the book, has stayed largely around zero. You know, you talked about the efforts to increase it, you know, sort of during the Trump presidency, and then right back down, you know, to 2020, where today it's just above zero, staying around there. So at least, you know, this doesn't capture the quantitative easing side and the money production, the money printing side, just the rate setting side, right?
If I could please interrupt, would you be willing to expand the bracket at the bottom to go back maybe just to even like 2000?
Yeah, of course.
Please, because this is such a telling and important graph. And that's a great graphic to show. Just keep that up on the screen. I'm kidding. But the interest rate graph. Sorry.
Yeah. So I'm going to share that again. I just have to. Here we go.
I love these graphs, and folks, I mean, basically, if you go back over, like back to 1960s, you see these interest rates tended to float between about 3 to 6%. Though that rate back there in 2004 was very, very low historically. This period from 2008 to 2016, when those rates are pinned at zero, is such an anomaly. It is such an historic anomaly. If there's one thing I could get across, it's that the Fed is doing things it's never done before. And then where your cursor is right now, you know, that's back when the Fed was trying desperately to raise interest rates in 2018. And interest rates only got up to about 2%. Okay, that was as high as they've been in a decade. And that is still historically extremely low. And God, I could just talk about this stuff all day. You see, they reached this peak, and then the Fed started cutting again before COVID hit. The Fed had to start cutting interest rates before COVID hit because of these very problems we've been talking about. The markets were addicted to low rates and easy money, and even trying to keep that interest rate up at a level of 2.5% was creating massive volatility in the market. So the Fed started to cut it back lower, and then boom, COVID hits and they slashed to zero. And so I think maybe a question on your mind might be, well, like, what the heck? Why not just keep interest rates at zero forever? Why did the Fed even try to raise it to 2.5%? The short answer is that easy money creates the meltdown in the nuclear core. that we talked about. It overheats the system. You see asset price inflation that is too hot and too high. You get housing bubbles, you get .com bubbles, you get corporate debt bubbles, which is what we have now. And then at some point you will see price inflation, which is what we're seeing now. So the Fed, that 0% interest rate from 08 to 16, that was a policy choice that leaders inside the Fed made. It was not some mathematical equation handed down from heaven. It was a policy choice. And I think as citizens, we're very entitled to interrogate the policy choice and explore it. And that's what I've tried to do as a first attempt in this book, is to sort of talk about what they were thinking and why they did that.
Mhm. So I do want to share the just the cover of the book so that folks can see it both online and here. We've been discussing the Lords of Easy Money, how the Federal Reserve broke the American economy with Christopher Leonard here. It's a great read. I gotta hit share again. Thanks, Howie. There we go. It's 12:48. We got Christopher, thanks so much for joining us. And just so you know, so we're in the state capital of New York State. Down the road, our elected officials and our governor are negotiating our state budget. And I think it's interesting to consider everything that goes into state budget negotiations in states across the country. And their hands are tied with respect to a significant part of the economy, as we've been talking about here today. Monetary policy is not a function of state government. We have ceded that to these board governors as part of the Federal Reserve, the Fed Board of Governors, the Fed Open Market Committee. So monetary policy is not a state issue. The rates that the FOMC set and the ability of private banks to borrow money from the Federal Reserve are not purview of state power, state authority. They're, Governor Hochul and her peers are not part of that process, which I think is an interesting thing. I know you said you're in Kansas, Chris. And I love some of the history about rural America and how just the impact of increase in farm value and sort of speculation in real estate across the country affects individuals and affects families and affects family wealth. So that was a significant takeaway for me when I was reading the book, and I think of our conversation too. And just for students participating and alums and others, as we think about we think about the power and ability of state elected officials, federal elected officials. A lot of this is a lot of monetary policy is not in their control at all. I don't know. Christopher, we usually finish up around 12:50. Parting words. Any concluding thoughts or takeaways that you would have for a room full of lawyers to be?
Yes. First of all, thank you. I really appreciate it. Really appreciate the time, and best of luck to everybody with the studies. I just love the field of law. It's fantastic. And I think my parting thought is, you just described a very difficult process of hammering out a state budget. Democracy is frustrating. It's messy. It's always a little bit dirty, but there simply is no substitute. I think one of the biggest pathologies I identify in the book is trying to outsource society's decisions to these undemocratic agencies like the Federal Reserve, that we can't rely on these central banks to print money to get us out of hard decisions. I just think that's the basic conclusion. And unfortunately, it's got to always come back to this very hard work of democracy. So that's my parting thought.
Yeah, great. Well, Christopher Leonard, thanks so much for being our guest today on our March edition of First Mondays. Thanks everyone attending in person and everyone who joined remotely. Thanks Howie for providing our tech, and have a great afternoon. And again, happy Stoneman Day here on campus and remote.
Thank you.
Thank you.